Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this week's Zoom session by the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. I wanted to take a moment to say that we're all greatly disturbed and sorry to hear of the passing of one of our very prominent former members, Dr. Robert Hoffman. Many of our people are not here today because they are attending a memorial service for him. He passed away on the weekend. So I'm going to pass over to Mike Nickerson. I hope you enjoyed today's talk.
Okay, well, in the general election of 1997, the Green Party candidate Peter Bevan-Baker pointed out that it was absurd that the expenses from an automobile accident are added to GDP, while GDP gives no credit to the health of the environment or the value of raising children. The Liberal, Joe Jordan, won the election and asked Peter to help him devise a Genuine Progress Index, GPI, for Canada. I had the good fortune to be included in publicizing the effort. Soon after our first outreach, Ron Colman got in touch with us and offered to help. Ron was already immersed in designing indicators of well-being for GPI Atlantic. He became a key author of the Canada Wellbeing Measurement Act. At one point he wrote, "Indicators are powerful. What we count and what we measure reflects our values as a society and literally determines what makes it onto the policy agenda of governments. As we proceed into the new millennium, these indicators tell us whether we are making progress, whether we're leaving the world better for the children, and what we need to change." In addition to the GPI Atlantic, Ron spent considerable time on similar efforts in New Zealand and Bhutan. He also coordinated the Prime Minister and government of Bhutan at the United Nations in an initiative to establish a full spectrum of social, environmental, and economic measurements to be used throughout the world. Ron has a deep passion for the well-being of present and future generations. It's my honor to introduce Ron Colman. Take it away, Ron.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you all for having me here this evening. I'm saying this evening. I know it's afternoon where you are. It's nighttime here in India. But I greatly appreciate the opportunity to have a discussion with you this evening. I thought I'd start out by talking basically about three different aspects of the work here. First of all, just to describe a little of the journey of the last 25 years, the work that I've been engaged in. And I thought a little bit about the lessons that I've learned from that, some hard lessons that I think we need to consider and contemplate. And then I thought I'd end with a few words on how can we realistically move forward from here. So what's this work that I've been doing all about? I don't want to talk only about measures of progress here. I think it's a bigger picture. Ordinary folk, I think, are generally bewildered by economics. They often feel stressed, overwhelmed, even victimized by how the economy affects them. And to be quite honest, I blame economists for a lot of the confusion. They somehow have managed to use jargon that enshrines them as the experts and that deliberately covers up the fatal flaws of the system which they promote. So somehow they've enshrined their economic model as a kind of super system to which all else, the natural world, our communities, our families, all of us bow down. And in the policy arena, literally the economy plays God. So without oversimplifying, I want to just say a few words in plain language about some of the ways our present economic system actually works and about how flimsy its foundations really are. Before we go on to talk about what might be a saner way forward and how practically we can get there. So this has been very hands-on work for me. I've worked with 3 different governments over 20 years to try to help in some small way to lay the foundations of what we could call a new economic paradigm. Starting in Nova Scotia, Canada, and then in New Zealand, in Bhutan, And finally, we took the initiative all the way to the United Nations. And at each point along the way, there seemed to be a lot of, let's call it hope. And in each case, we've also faced major disappointments. And I think there's lessons to be learned from some of those disappointments. So I think with this, from everything I know about this group and the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, you'll be very familiar with some of the flaws of GDP accounting. So I don't want to bore you with going over that, but I think there are a few points worth mentioning, because I think that this is an area very often misunderstood. So GDP, or gross domestic product, has actually been called by experts, and I quote, the most powerful statistic in human history. So what is that number? So that number is GDP is a single number that adds up basically how much stuff we produce and how much we buy and sell. And a lot of people have somehow dismissed the importance of GDP, but I want to start out by emphasizing that GDP is not the problem. It's not the number that's the issue. In fact, it's a handy number to know. We should always have it. But that calculation of gross domestic product is not what makes GDP so powerful. And I think this is what's sometimes misunderstood. GDP itself is not the problem, and it's not what makes it powerful. The problem begins when economists and politicians think, as they always do these days, that their main job is to make that number grow. That's where the issue really is. So this is sometimes called economic growth, and our politicians, our economists are fixated on making the economy grow, on growing the economy. So GDP is then misused for a purpose that its architects never intended. Namely, it's used to tell us whether we're better off or worse off. And that's the fundamental flaw in the way GDP is actually misused. It's assumed that the more GDP and the faster we can make it grow is better. And to convince us of that, it's very interesting that, and journalists, by the way, fall right into this habit. We borrow words from the health profession. So they then talk about our economy being healthy if GDP is growing. And if it's not growing fast enough, then the economy is described as weak and sickly and so forth. So what makes GDP so powerful is its alignment with the notion of health and well-being, that somehow a growing economy is a healthy economy. This is the problem. And that's what makes GDP so powerful. Now, interestingly enough, the primary architect of GDP accounting, Simon Kuznets, Nobel Prize winner, warned 70 years ago that if you want to know if we're better off, you have to ask what is growing, what we're producing, what we're buying, not how much. And no one listened to it. And I mean, anything can make the GDP grow. More arms manufacturing, more war, more cigarette and junk food sales, more drug and hospital bills, more crime that makes us spend more money on prisons, more pollution, natural disasters that make us spend more money on cleaning up the mess. So long as you're spending money, GDP will grow. So it's a completely materialist measure, devoid of any values. But does that kind of GDP growth, does GDP growth per se mean we're better off? Even logically, how could it tell us if we're better off? Better and worse are value judgments. In other words, the problem is not GDP. There's no need to mess with it or adjust it. And I'm not in favor of what's called green GDP, attempts to adjust the GDP. GDP is fine as it is, so long as it's used only for the purpose for which it was intended, to measure the size of the market economy. The problem is its constant misuse as a measure of progress and well-being, and therefore the constant fixation on making it grow. Now, maybe worst of all, GDP counts only what we extract from nature and sell in the market. It totally ignores what we leave behind, even though we totally depend on what we leave behind for future well-being. So I generally live in Nova Scotia, and we had an issue there right up to the collapse of the Atlantic groundfish stocks in 1992. Economists, politicians, journalists were praising the fishing industry as a boom industry with its record fish landings. GDP only counted what we took out of the oceans, not what we were leaving behind. Scientists who were warning of declining fish stocks due to overfishing were ignored by economists and politicians who were fixated on growth. We're doing the same today with forests. GDP counts the timber we extract and sell, and it ignores the declining and degraded forests we leave behind. And of course, it's no wonder that despite all the talk, we can't really act on climate change. After all, the more fossil fuels we sell and burn, and the more greenhouse gases we emit, the more the economy will grow. And that, of course, the economists celebrate. David Attenborough, I think, said it best when he remarked, quote, "Anyone who thinks that you can have infinite growth in a finite environment is either a madman or an economist." I think that says it. But that's not all that, is the problem with measuring GDP growth as a measure of being better off. GDP will grow even if it's only the rich getting richer while the poor stay poor or get poorer. And while the middle class loses real income. That happened right there in Canada. It happened in the United States. It's happened in many other countries. So GDP and economic growth are just averages. They tell us nothing about the growing gap between rich and poor. There's an old joke among number crunchers like us that if you have your feet in the refrigerator and your head in the oven, then on average, your body temperature is going to be just fine. Your well-being, however, is another matter. To know how well off we really are, we need to know who's on fire and who's being left out in the cold. What's happening right in my hometown of Halifax. Halifax is booming. It's one of the fastest growing cities in Canada. Developers are making a mint. Housing rents are skyrocketing. And the news headlines say, Halifax Partnership confident in city's economic growth. The mayor of Halifax says all this growth is something that we're celebrating. So just the fact that this growth is going on is being celebrated by our politicians, our economists alike. But interestingly, for us in the Maritimes, with the values that we proudly cherish here, and I don't mind saying this to you Upper Canadians, but really we are particularly proud of certain values that we hold here. And I think we're particularly poorly served by this most powerful statistic in human history. For instance, in the Maritimes, we have the highest rate of volunteer work in the country. People caring for each other, caring for their communities. The GDP only counts work for pay. So all of that unpaid work that we're quite proud of in the Atlantic region actually remains invisible to economists and policymakers. In fact, that is so absurd. The GDP architect, Simon Kuznets, actually cut relations with the US Commerce Department over its refusal to count unpaid work. After all, Kuznets argued, production is production, whether paid or unpaid. And if the GDP claims to measure production, it has to include both. But GDP as it's used today is does not count unpaid work, only counts paid work in the market economy. but it's absurd. For instance, look after your own child, you're worth nothing to GDP. Pay a stranger to look after your child, you're contributing to GDP and making the economy grow. Hire someone to clean your house, the GDP goes up. Marry your housekeeper, the GDP goes down. So in fact, we have a whole section in this book that I wrote about this that actually describes how our economic system particularly devalues women who do most of the unpaid work in the world. Women's work is particularly undervalued because it is women who carry the greatest burden of unpaid work. So we could go on about the flaws of this method of measuring growth as if it were progress. When machines replace jobs, GDP could grow. So long as we keep shopping, GDP will grow, even if we're going deeper and deeper into debt and more. So I think it's important to start with what this most powerful statistic in human history is, what it does, and what it doesn't do, and how its misuse gives wrong information to policymakers, and how it actually produces bad policy. And worse than that, how it leads us down a deadly and dangerous path that now seriously threatens our children's future. But I think you gather from the title of this talk that this talk is not a complaint. It's actually about how do we chart a new way forward. And I think once we know what's wrong, once we call out the deception, we actually know what to do about it. And that's the work of the last 25 years that I want to say a few words about. Once we actually recognize what the problem is, we actually have the solution at hand. So that's basically the good news. We do have ways of measuring progress properly and accurately. We have ways of giving good information to policymakers. So we called that work a genuine progress index, but it also goes under several other names. But I think it's even more than just a way of measuring. Given the prevailing materialist ethos of our world, counting right is absolutely necessary to shape good policy, but it's not all that's needed. So what we've tried to do over the last 25 years is point to a bigger picture, the new economic model that we desperately need. A new economic model of which accurate measures of progress are an essential part. And the good news here is that we actually have all the knowledge, all the expertise, the resources, and the good working models on which to build, on which to create a genuinely secure, sustainable, equitable, and prosperous economy, society, and future for our children. Now, before we actually started this session, there were a few of us online, and there was a little discussion among a couple of the people online about, is it really a good idea to drive people into despair? Shouldn't we actually feed people hope? And one person was arguing that, no, you need despair to make people act. And another was arguing, no, then they just give up and don't act. But actually, I would argue that you need both. You have to tell the truth about what's wrong. And at the same time, that very truth produces the solution we need. The reality is we've got no excuse. We can't plead ignorance. We know what to do. We know how to do it. So I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish here, so I'm going to talk a little about why that is not happening. Even though we have all the means, all the resources, all the knowledge, all the working models to do what's needed, why is it not happening? So what are the daunting letdowns and challenges that I faced working with 3 governments over 25 years to try to implement some of these measures? What can we do about it? So I want to give a very few examples of, there are many more in the book that I've written, but I'll just give a few examples to illustrate the significance of this. So since food is basic to survival, let alone health, let's start talking about food for a few minutes. Start with farming. So what does GDP count? GDP counts what's called farm cash receipts. So it's what farmers are actually bringing in. So when you look at the Statistics Canada's agricultural accounts, you'll see this category, farm cash receipts. It's the income that farmers get. What GDP does not do is compare that number to how much more it's costing farmers to farm. So it hides the reality that those farm expenses and farm debt have been growing astronomically, way faster than income. Now I'm taking this as an example because there's a reason that GDP is called gross domestic product. That gross has an actual meaning. It actually only measures one side of the equation. By contrast, all we're doing with the Genuine Progress Index is measuring both sides of the equation. We simply call it net accounting as opposed to gross accounting. Income in relation to expenses, assets in relation to debt. And by the way, that includes the ecological deficit that we build up by consuming more than the earth can provide. And that's just common sense. Now, this is, I want to digress for a minute here because a lot of alternative measures of progress, I think, fall way short. And I think we need to address this honestly. There are two basic forms of measurement. One we can call indicators. So for example, are smoking rates increasing or decreasing? That's an indicator. And we can measure whether health is improving or not improving due to rising or lower smoking rates. But GDP is not an indicator. GDP is an accounting system. And there's a second form of measurement which measures value. So when I talk about net accounting as opposed to gross accounting, I'm not talking only about indicators. I'm talking about a measure of value. I'm talking about an accounting system. Unless we actually develop a system of full cost accounting, of net accounting, all of our alternative indicator work will be beautiful, but it will not dent the economic paradigm we have now in which GDP is king. We'll be paving the side streets beautifully while the GDP steamroller keeps on barreling down the superhighway. Unless we develop an alternative measure of accounting, we will not challenge GDP. So what our Genuine Progress Index tries to do is actually to develop a net system of accounting, not just a smoking rates increasing or decreasing, but what does smoking cost the economy? That's a measure of value. So I think this is critically important to understand from the start. So I want to give some examples. By the way, this gross accounting of measuring how much we're producing, that alone, may have made sense when GDP was first used, as it was in the Second World War, to figure out how fast we were ramping up production for the war effort. But it makes no sense now. So let's come back to food, to farming. From a GPI perspective, we looked at 5 key indicators of real farm economic viability, such as income versus expenses, assets versus debt, and so on. The first report we produced in 1999 was a clear warning signal. We saw that net farm income and real farm economic viability was steadily declining over a 35-year period. It was a clear signal that our maritime farmers, and we did this report for the maritime region, were in trouble. Sadly, our policymakers ignored the warning signals. 10 years later, we produced a second report using the same 5 indicators of net farm economic viability. We did it for Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick. In each case, 10 years later, we found that net farm economic viability had dipped below 0. It was now costing farmers more to farm than they were getting in income. Their debt load had mushroomed. Not surprisingly, farmers were bailing out. They were selling their farms. Young folk were refusing to jump onto a sinking ship, and the farm population was aging fast. When we released those results, the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture was ecstatic just to get our numbers. This is what they said. They told us, this is what we've been saying all along, but we only had anecdotal evidence. No one listened. At last, we've got the numbers to prove what we already know. Now the politicians will listen. Quote unquote. This is what they said at the time. Or so they thought, so we hoped. But the GDP stranglehold remained solid, nothing changed. It didn't have to be that way. Used properly, the Nova Scotia Genuine Progress Index has been sending early warning signals over and over again. A measure of net accounting actually enables governments to take timely remedial action before fish stocks collapse, before small farms die out, before we're overwhelmed by the drought, wildfires, disease, and rising seas caused by catastrophic climate change. A net accounting system is actually predictive. So when we actually measure assets against debts, against liabilities, income against debt, we can actually predict, we can actually see the trends, and we actually know what action to take to ward off catastrophe. So we use the same net accounting system with climate change, transportation, health, forests, economic security, and a lot else. Instead of looking only what it will cost us to cut greenhouse gas emissions, that's what politicians are always worried about. That's one side of the equation. We also looked at the best climate change models to examine what it will cost us if we don't cut those emissions. So when we hear politicians talk, they're always talking about, can we afford to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? The net accounting system, which is not used, actually shows that cost against the cost of not cutting emissions. The clear conclusion of any net accounting system, the science and the economic numbers prove that timely action now is hugely cost effective compared to the shattering costs of climate change damages down the line. Now, we use that same approach with straight economic numbers. When we simply looked at income and spending, the gross approach, we looked at Canadians and Maritimers' debt compared to their income, a net approach. What we found was shocking. We didn't anticipate this. For 80% of Canadians, all except the richest 20%, we found that debt was growing at a much faster rate than income. GDP tells us nothing about this. So this was we released this report back in 2008. And at that time, we warned of a coming economic crisis as growing numbers of people would be unable to make payments on their debt. We found that 77,000 households just in the Atlantic provinces were so seriously in debt that they wouldn't be able to pay off their debts even if they sold everything they owned, including their homes. So this was in early 2008. We released this report. And we always have our reports reviewed by experts in the field. So we showed this to the head of a very large and reputable Canadian bank, I'm not sure if I should say the name, without disputing our data. The head of that bank looked at our calculations, looked at our numbers, didn't dispute any of it, and then said, we had to be wrong. He said, Canadian household finances have never been more healthy and secure, quote unquote. He didn't dispute the calculations, the methods, the numbers, but he said our conclusion had to be wrong. A few weeks after we released our report, the crash came. The Canadian economy fell into recession. Exports declined by 16%, investments by 22%, 400,000 jobs were lost. The Canadian dollar lost 20% of its values, and Canadian households found their finances far from healthy and secure. We weren't surprised. Any net system of accounting could have predicted the trouble. The gross system that economists swear by failed them. And yet so deeply entrenched is the GDP dogma and belief system that people blamed Alan Greenspan and the other economic gurus for missing the signals. But they never looked at the actual blinders that prevented them from seeing the truth. So we used this net approach across the board with all of our work. We tabulated the true costs of driving, including from accidents, congestion, land use, air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and more, which are way higher than what drivers themselves pay to operate their cars. And then we were able to look at win-win solutions that are economically, socially, and environmentally beneficial, that can move us to a far more sustainable, convenient, and equitable transportation system. Over a 50-year period, using forest inventories dating back to 1958, we carefully charted the decline and degradation of our Nova Scotia forests due to clear cutting. The numbers clearly showed that we'd lost all of our old growth forests. We'd lost the age and species diversity that used to keep our forests healthy. They're now way more susceptible to disease and infestation. We'd even lost the value of the wide diameter clear timber that old forests have. So even our timber is worth a lot less. We saw the decline in forest soils and in habitat for birds and animals and more. And we graphed the 38% loss in carbon storage capacity that costs society, just in Nova Scotia, $1.3 billion in lost value. Instead of being the carbon sinks that our forests used to be, Canada's forests are now net emitters of carbon. And this was interesting because the forest industry didn't like our results. They showed too clearly that they'd have to change their habits. So the industry spent a lot of money trying to discredit our work. They actually hired a very expensive accounting firm, KPMG, to actually do a forensic audit of all of our work. They never proved any of it wrong. And I'm proud to say that altogether over a 25-year period, our GPI data, our methods, our calculations and results have borne up against close scrutiny. They've withstood the test of time. KPMG and the forest industry never actually issued a report on their forensic audit of our results. But they were threatened because clear cutting was clearly damaging the value of our forests. Despite the clear evidence, the forestry industry didn't have to change its ways, and that's largely because our Department of Natural Resources was largely in its pocket. So with those examples, you might think the GPI is just full of bad news, but that's really not so, not at all. We produced a second volume of forest accounts detailing viable, prosperous, successful, sustainable forestry operations that use only selection harvesting, no clear cutting, and some of them in Canada. More good news, we proved that our leading edge sustainable waste management system in Nova Scotia using composting and recycling was saving us lots of money compared to the old system that dumped everything into landfills. We made the economic case for sewage treatment that would clean up Halifax Harbor compared to dumping all our sewage into the harbor as we were doing up to that point. We tabulated the costs of secondhand smoke, and our numbers were used not just in Atlantic Canada, but in Ottawa and elsewhere in Canada to ban smoking in restaurants and bars. We proved with hard numbers that we could save 25% of our current healthcare costs if Nova Scotians didn't smoke, had healthy wastes, and exercised regularly. And our chief medical officer, who's still leading us now, used our numbers and really helped push the case for a proactive policy of health promotion and disease prevention. And this was a rare case where government actually listened to us. So after we released our results, the Nova Scotia government actually used our GPI numbers to create a new Department of Health Promotion, to promote a healthy nutrition program for schools and a comprehensive tobacco control strategy that sharply cut smoking rates. I mean, I could go on about the good news. I mean, I've got lots here, but I don't think we have time for all of this. So I'm going to just give one other little example here. When we released our numbers on voluntary work, we showed that voluntary work actually produces the equivalent in Nova Scotia of $1.9 billion of value a year. If volunteers simply stopped doing what they were doing, either the Nova Scotia government would have to replace that work for pay, or our quality of life and standard of living would decline. So there's nothing in GDP that counts that volunteer work. And interestingly enough, the volunteer groups use that work. Every year they have a feel-good Volunteer of the Year award dinner. And when the Premier of Nova Scotia came on stage to present the award, they gave him a huge check for $1.9 billion and said, "Mr. Premier, this is our contribution to the economy of Nova Scotia." So I'm mentioning these examples because these are policy relevant. These are not academic numbers intended to sit on a shelf. Every one of these numbers, every one of these figures has direct policy implications. We can actually create the economy and the sustainable, equitable society we need by using this net accounting approach, which is basically common sense. It really is common sense, simply to measure benefits and costs, income and expenses. It's simply common sense to have an accounting system that measures both sides of the equation. So the key message is basically that measuring things right, counting what really matters, is essential to creating the new sustainable and equitable economy that we all need in the future that we all want. And I think there's no disagreement. In fact, I can say with confidence that across the political spectrum, from left to right, who doesn't want better health for our people, greater economic security, decent work, a clear and healthy natural environment, less crime, safe and strong communities, less poverty, better education. So these are values which are inherent in our societies. It's not a matter of left or right or of ideological dogma. And all of that is measurable. Why ignore what really matters in the narrow, single-minded focus on growing the economy and increasing GDP? Well, if the answer to that seems obvious, and if adopting something like a GPI seems like a no-brainer, it certainly does to me, and it certainly does to Mike Nickerson there, who actually created a GPI, Wellbeing Measurement Act for Canada. So if all of this is obvious, why hasn't it happened? Why is it not happening? So I don't want to leave you with a downer here, but to tell the truth, I think that we have to have a bit of a reality check here. The only reason that we ever started this work in the 1990s is to make it happen in practice, not just as an academic exercise to sit on some shelf. And we were convinced naively as it turns out, that the reason we were seeing bad, short-sighted policy is that policymakers were getting wrong and misleading information. I really believed for 2 decades that all we had to do was provide good evidence and tell the truth. Who wouldn't want that? And we figured that policy people would simply grab it and use it to make good, far-sighted policy that would benefit not just us, but our children and the natural world. Well, so I thought. So the first shock we had was right back at home in Nova Scotia in 2009, right after we completed our Nova Scotia Genuine Progress Index. We gave all of our work for free to the Nova Scotia government. We gave all our GPI spreadsheets to the statistics office in the Department of Finance, so the province could easily and regularly update the numbers. We produced a policy manual. We actually gave training workshops to civil servants. We offered our top researcher to the government to help implement the GPI. At the very time we did all this, the political party that had regularly used our GPI numbers while in opposition, and which promised in its election platform to adopt the GPI if elected, came to power with an absolute majority. That was the NDP. We were full of vim and hope. Once elected, they ignored this and many other promises they made, wouldn't answer mail or phone calls, carried on GDP-based business as usual. So I described that disappointment in gruesome detail in this book, but it was a sad moment. We were actually full of hope that this would actually be adopted. In a way, I still feel that way among the people. I feel that Maritimers understand this. All of our work got good news coverage and people responded well to it, but it did not find its ground on our home ground. Now, we never took our work really outside Canada or outside Nova Scotia for that matter, outside the Maritimes. But somehow people heard about it, so we were asked to lead the research for the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, which frankly has also proved a big disappointment. You can ask me about that in the question period if you want. And I was asked to present our work in New Zealand and also in Bhutan. And in those 2 countries, the political will to adopt the new measures did seem to exist. So I don't want to run over time here, but I'll just say a very few words. I focused here on Canada, but I'll just say that I spent 10 years working in Bhutan with the Bhutan government. And that government did actually firmly believe in balancing its economic development with caring for the natural world, with good governance, with strengthening its culture and communities. And we took that work all the way to the United Nations, and Bhutan, as a sovereign nation state and member of the United Nations, actually led the drive for what we called a global new economic paradigm to replace the existing GDP system. We called it a new Bretton Woods. And again, that we described in detail what that new economic paradigm would look like based on genuine sustainability, fair distribution, efficient and not wasteful use of resources. And at that United Nations meeting, we were full of hope. That was in 2012. We had luminaries from Prince Charles to Nobel Prize winners to religious leaders. President of Costa Rica came, the United Nations Secretary General came, and he said, the old model is broken. We need a new one. People seemed to be on side. We had 800 people, like from all sectors of society from around the world. We lined up a fantastic team of 70 top economists, scientists, scholars, statisticians to flesh out the details of the new economic system. And just as we started to get real with the work, powerful vested interests stepped in. They actually literally threatened Bhutan for stepping out of line. They pulled the plug on the initiative. Bhutan gave in to pressure. And all of that, how it fell apart, is also described in somewhat distressing detail in this book. But We've been through a few disappointments. I mean, here I focused on Canada, but the Bhutanese, the experience in Bhutan is actually half of this book, the second half of the book. I have to say in concluding that I really did think that speaking the truth mattered. I firmly believed in the power of evidence, and I no longer believe that. And not just in relation to our GPI work. Climate scientists are in despair. For 35 years, we've had all the evidence we need on climate change. They've been pouring out the reports, one report after another, and they haven't been listened to. It's not just us measurement people who are measuring progress who are in despair. So despite all the warning signals, despite the foretastes that we've had, like the devastating fires in Australia and on the West Coast, we know about the Greenland ice sheet melting. We know that if it keeps melting as it does, London, England will be underwater. We've had all the statistics, we've had all the numbers we need. We know that we're plundering the world's resources like never before. We've had all the numbers we need on that. We know that we're consuming resources 70% faster than they can be replenished. And at that point, when that ecological collapse happens, we know that no amount of hand washing or mask wearing or social distancing are going to help, and no vaccines are going to come to the rescue. So it's we've had to face the reality that evidence and reports are not listened to. So I'm a few minutes over time, so I'm just going to say two things to end. One is there's a section in chapter 14 of this book, it's called The Elephant in the Room, and it asks the question, is there something about the inherent nature and structure of our capitalist economic system that is inherently incompatible with sustainability? Can we actually achieve change within this capitalist economic system? That's a taboo question. We don't dare ask that question in policy circles these days or in respectable circles. But I think it's time we have to face that question. We have to understand why the evidence is not talking, why it has not made a dent in the policy arena. And there's a second hard lesson, and I think I want to end with this, is that I think, looking back, that for 25 years, we've aimed all our work at the wrong audience. We wanted to satisfy the experts. We produced copious reports, rigorously footnoted, and the experts haven't found fault with our numbers and our reports. We aimed it at the policy audience, but I think that the policymakers are in some ways puppets of these existing powerful interests. The spark that came along for me 3 years ago was a 16-year-old Swedish schoolgirl who started to speak the truth in a way that made people listen. And in the last couple of years, I've been following her every move very, very closely. And I'm thinking now that our policymakers, our economists, they are not the change agents. It's our 16, 17-year, 18-year-olds. We've robbed them of their future. We've stolen their future from them. They have less at stake than we do. They're prepared to act. They have to act to protect their own future. And I'm realizing that maybe for 25 years we've been aiming at this policy audience, and maybe that's our real audience, that maybe the Gretas of this world are actually the people who can use these numbers. And Greta, by the way, always says, don't listen to me, listen to the scientists. She is listening. She's listening to the numbers. So I'm thinking that that maybe that's our real audience. And I was looking at the pictures of everyone on the screen when we started. We're old folk, you know. Everyone who's I mean, I didn't see many young people here when we started out, but I think that that we need to recognize that we are not the change makers. If we can feed our numbers in a way that's useful to our teenagers, maybe that's the only place that that hope can come from. Okay, I'm in India now. I've spent a lot of years. I've spent 14 years living in Bhutan and India. I'll just say one last remark. I keep saying it's the last thing. This is it. But Delhi, during the first lockdown we had blue skies for the first time in living memory. No one could remember the air quality actually registering good. People in the Punjab, for the first time, actually saw the Himalayan mountains in the distance. They didn't know they were there. We've actually shown that we are capable of grinding the existing system to a halt if we want to, and starting out afresh. We could be starting out afresh with a new way forward. The possibility exists. We don't have to keep going down the same path that's leading us to deadly destruction. We actually have proved that we can stop that system in its tracks, and we have the possibility of moving forward in a new way. So excuse me for going a bit over time, and I'd be delighted to engage in some discussion.
Well, thank you for that, Ron. You've put the case very, very clearly. I just a little bit swept away by your closing comments. We've had a few number of people want to comment and make questions, so I'll mention Dave Doherty is up first, and Art Hunter would be next. Dave has got a couple of comments about existing measures, wants to know what you think, and question about where we might be pursuing the youth group. So Dave, carry on.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Dr. Colman. I was very interested by your comment about not being able to measure the gap between the rich and poor. And it occurred to me that we actually have at least one, and there may be other current indicators. They certainly don't get the kind of attention that GDP does. The Gini coefficient is the main one that comes to my mind. Yes. So I wonder if you'd make a comment or two about the Gini coefficient.
Oh, absolutely. So, and we use the Gini coefficient in our work. Of course we did, because we were looking at both sides of the equation. So this is what I meant when I said we actually have all of the methods. We know how to measure things properly. The Gini coefficient has been around a long time, and the Gini coefficient measures inequality at every stage of the income. But we also have ways of measuring by quintile. So we can measure the richest 10%, the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 10%. That's not Gini coefficient, but we have several ways of measuring wealth gap, income gap, Gini coefficient all along the income scale. For every one of these things I've measured, whether it's fish stocks, forest inventories, gap between rich and poor, we know how to do it right. We actually have the capacity, the methodologies. We're simply standing on the shoulders of pioneers who've been developing these methods for the last 30, 40 years. The good news is that now we actually have all of these methods available to us. The problem is that the GDP bulldozer, we have not yet developed a system of net accounting to stand against GDP accounting. We haven't yet incorporated all of these measures into an alternative accounting system. That's what we're trying to do.
There is perhaps a little bit of bright news on the horizon. I located a report on the Genuine Progress Indicator for Canada, published in, at least put up on the internet by the Government of Canada in 2021. You're probably aware of it, but it actually comes from the Department of Finance.
Yeah. Okay, now, now this is getting, I have to be very careful here, because for 20 years, I'll be honest with you, I'm on kind of shaky ground here. I never wanted to criticize my colleagues. because I felt like we were all in the same camp, and even though we were doing things a bit differently, there's a problem with that one you're citing. The baseline of that measure you're citing, so I am going to be critical here, even though I'm glad that this GPI for Canada has been posted, but I tell you what, it's not done very well. It still uses gross spending and income as its baseline. So it still starts with a basic, it's basically an adjustment to GDP. And at the very beginning, I was saying there's no need to mess with GDP. Let GDP do what it does, but put it in its place. It's not that important a measure. If you produce your GDP numbers once a year, that's plenty. There's no reason to spend all these resources churning out the GDP numbers monthly, as is presently done. Totally unnecessary. On the contrary, it gives false signals because little bumps in seasonal bumps produce misleading information. So this GPI, which, it's sad. Yeah, I've tried not to criticize my colleagues, but I have to say, when something like that appears, I have to say it's not properly done.
Yeah, I was also very interested when the pandemic hit us. People were saying all kinds of things about what was happening to GDP because they were comparing economic numbers from the latest quarter to, say, a year before, which was absolutely ridiculous thing to be doing.
Right, exactly.
We're in a pandemic. We were not in a pandemic a year before. And then a year or two later, they were trying to say, oh, look at this tremendous growth we're having. We're coming out of a pandemic. Don't you realize you should be comparing to what was happening before the pandemic? You could argue about whether, in fact, the pandemic is over. I don't think it is. I myself just got out of my sick bed about a week ago. Anyway, thank you very much. Onwards.
Hey, Art, you're next.
Yeah, I've taken.
Welch is following. Go on.
Okay, I've taken my original question and junked it because you responded very nicely to it. But I was really taken by your comment that says we really have to help the young people take charge here because we're failing. And one of the things that is passing through my head is, well, if we have GDP and we've got historic graphs of GDP, is it possible to have a similar historic graph of GPI that says, here's the difference? And if in fact we would have had GPI as something that is guiding policy, we would have likely to have done something differently. And ultimately to give, as it were, the younger generation the evidence that GPI is a very powerful tool and that GDP should in fact be scrapped. Has anybody ever tried to plot GDP and GPI on the same graph?
Yes, absolutely. But this is a problem. Okay, we're getting into a little of the technicality here, but this is a really important question. So I'm gonna, yes, that's been done. It's been done over time, but the GPI that is plotted on those graphs is a single number. We have never, in all of our work, aggregated all of our results to a single number. To me, it makes no sense to try to put climate change costs in the same category as volunteer work or gap between rich and poor. These are different numbers. They can't be aggregated into one single number. Even health. Look, we know that smoking rates have gone down, but obesity rates have gone up. So I suppose you could say on average, health risks have stayed stable, but that's not what policymakers need to know. They need to know that smoking rates went down and obesity rates went up. It doesn't even make sense within one category to lump everything into one overall average. That's why I was saying averages are very, very misleading. I think that people are intelligent enough to grasp smoking rates are down, obesity rates are up. So I think to plot GPI against GDP in a graph means that you have to aggregate all the numbers to a single number. So you're coming up with some average. But does it make sense to plot climate change costs against smoking rates? Or I've always, and unfortunately, and this is again, okay, I've held off for 20 years on doing this, but I'm going to say it now. This is where I'm at loggerheads with some of my colleagues because they do want to aggregate everything into a single number. I know it's pretty, I know it's simple, but I would give people more credit. I think that people are more intelligent they can actually understand, yes, we're doing well here, but we have a problem there. I think we have to present the numbers as they are for each category. We don't aggregate.
Yeah, I guess I'm back to Greta again, and I put myself in Greta's position and says, give me the arguments, give me the data, give me the facts. Let me see historically how badly GDP has served humanity.
Oh, that's easy to do. That we can do, Art. That's not a problem. So we can actually plot economic growth statistics against increases in greenhouse gas emissions. So we can actually demonstrate directly that economic growth is directly linked with increased greenhouse gas emissions. So that's definitely possible to do. But what Greta's talking about are the actual numbers on climate change costs, climate change damages. So what we're looking at is, in our work, is what we call control costs against damage costs. Control costs are what are the costs of actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And there are some costs, no question about it. And that can be plotted, it can be graphed, it can be calculated. And we plot that against the damage costs of not taking action. So that number, I think, is the number that Greta can use. I think that Greta can use what are the economic costs of not taking action on climate change. So
Okay.
I think that those numbers can be provided.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Okay, on deck would be John Mayer. The floor is yours, Andrew.
Thank you. And thanks very much for the talk. I just had a couple of questions that kind of fit together here. My feeling is that any index which shows that the current government is failing the population will never be adopted by that government. And similarly, predictive indices that use net accounting will never be used by governments because governments don't get credit for avoiding disasters in the future, especially when they come at a cost, because people never saw the disaster, it was avoided. So the governments are not interested in evidence-based policy, they're interested in policy-based evidence. How do we force this change to happen? That's sort of the first part. The second part is that in just saying, seeing what you said yourself, it seems that the only GPI reports that save money are the ones that are considered good news and policy relevant and thus adopted. So the question is, why is monetary wealth still the only indicator of well-being that's considered as worth counting, as something that really matters? And I think that we all, as individuals, need to measure value differently. And I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Okay. So those are two very important questions. The first one, China actually at one point adopted a green GDP, and it discontinued that after the costs of air pollution to the economy actually came out. So China did actually start down this track, and for exactly the reasons you say, it stopped doing it. India promised to do it, and then backed out because figures very quickly became clear on what the economic costs of air pollution were. So that's why I say policymakers are not actually our audience. They are not the change makers. And I think you put your finger right on it. I would kind of up the ante there a little bit and ask whether democracy, which we all cherish so dearly, is really our friend and ally here. When politicians think in 4-year and 5-year cycles, what's going to get them elected? And when vested interests have their pull and contribute to election campaigns, and I wonder whether we cherish democracy, but really, is it what we need at a time of, when the future of humanity on this planet is at stake? I think we have to dare to ask these questions. It's not politically correct to talk about capitalism
Politics
and
aren't correct.
democracy. Yeah, it's not. But I think unless we start asking the politically incorrect questions, we're not going to make progress. And so, I mean, what you said is exactly why we came to the conclusion that policymakers were not the agents of change. You put your finger on it. Okay, the second question is a very interesting one. The work that we do, which we call full cost accounting, is criticized for exactly the reason you said. Why should we put a dollar value on things that they are true, they're values that go far beyond monetary worth, and they're not even intent. Money was invented as a medium of exchange for the market economy. It's not meant to calculate the state of the environment or the state of population health. So at the and it's in the book as well, I wrote quite a bit about this very question that you're raising. The Genuine Progress Index with its full cost accounting is not an end in itself. It's simply a strategy. Money is what talks, and so we have no choice but to use economic language to actually get the point across. So it was only when we actually showed that smoking, unhealthy weights, and sedentary lifestyles cost the Nova Scotia government 25% more in healthcare costs that the finance minister started to pay attention. Until then, health was just that was health department's business. But the cabinet came on board when the economic numbers came out. And the volunteer organizations, as I mentioned in that example I gave, far from saying, oh, our work is being denigrated by putting an economic number on it, they used our number to actually make the case for the value of their work, instead of their work being hidden. So what I'm saying is that putting a monetary value on it is not an end. It is only a tactic. It's perhaps a strategy to get people to pay attention to what's currently hidden, what's currently off the agenda. All we're trying to do is get it on the agenda, and because money makes the world go round, and it's what influences the way policymakers think, it's actually a tool of communication with the conventional world. That's all it is. That's why we do that's what full cost accounting is.
Right. I had one more comment before I close. You asked, is there something inherently incompatible between the capitalist market economy system and nature? And I think there is. I wrote a book about it. And to me, it is the very simple fact that when you measure success by number, more is always worth more. And there is nothing in nature that works that way. Even right. You raised democracy. Democracy, more votes are worth more than fewer votes, regardless of who's actually doing the voting. It's the same system as money. So to me, to my mind, that is the incompatibility right there, is that you're basing something on a system where more is always worth more, and nothing else in the universe works that way.
Yeah, and not only in I think that translates into very, very practical things. If a business wants to stay in business, it has to chase cheaper labor, doesn't it? I mean, by logic, if you want to pay your workers twice as much, you'll be forced out of business by the company that pays its workers less. So there are, that little section of the book really asks the questions, what are the inherent features? So the economies of scale are going to be more effective than the little bookstore owner. Amazon is going to force the little bookstore owner out of business. So I think the real issue with is questioning capitalism as a system is that we have to, okay, I'll tell you a little secret, that this book was published in the United States of America by Columbia University Press. And I was advised that I should not use the word Karl Marx in the book. But actually, there's a, because it's persona non grata in the United States. But actually, there's a lot about his analysis of the capitalist system, which is very, very accurate, actually. Of course, he couldn't know about climate change. He couldn't know about resource depletion writing in the mid-19th century. But still, the analysis of how capitalism works and how it develops is not off base. It's actually quite accurate in many ways. But one thing that's necessary to look at is that systems of the past, like slavery and feudalism, we today assume that they're bygone systems. But capitalism is very new. Feudalism lasted, what, 1,000 years in Europe? Capitalism is what, 250, 300 years old? It's not a, why should we assume that this system is the be all and end all and is going to last forever? Can we come up with a better system? And it doesn't mean that somehow we have to go the path of the Soviet Union or China. That is such a misunderstanding. Like I said, we have to look at a sustainable economy. We have to look at how to actually, look at the reality that we now know from science, that the Earth has finite resources. We live on a finite planet. So we're not talking about simply going down some path that those countries have tried. We're talking about creating a genuinely new economic system that fits the knowledge that we have today.
Thank you.
Well done. Paul Beckwith on deck. John Mayer, it's your turn. You there, John? Oh, maybe Paul wants to make his comment first. We'll come back to John.
Yeah. Thank you. Great talk. Are you selling copies of your book directly yourself? And also, I just finished reading they call it a science fiction. Kim Stanley Robinson wrote an excellent book on climate change and setting up something called the Ministry for the Future to take care of the concerns of people that are not yet born, which of course nobody's really doing now. But there's some excellent discussions of different economic indicators in there, including these progressive indexes that you've been talking about. Also something called a carbon coin. So it's the idea of a, something like a digital currency that took a value for every ton of carbon that was produced, there would be a coin covering that, and then it would have a market value, and it would encourage people with fossil fuel reserves in the ground to get paid sort of upfront for their reserves, but their reserves to stay in the ground. And there's some interesting ideas. I'm just wondering if you've had a chance to have a look at the book, or what you might think of a carbon coin.
I have the book and I haven't read it yet. I got it, but I've still got it. It's on my reading list.
Okay. Yeah, I think you'll find it very interesting.
I'm sure. I've heard a lot of good things about it. I think it starts with a devastating heat wave in India, which is what we're having right now, actually.
Yes.
I'm in India now. We're having basically since mid-March, temperatures have been in the 40s.
Has the monsoon started yet in your region, or I guess it starts in the west and moves its way towards the east?
Not yet.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. John Meyer, you're on, and David Doherty. Oh, well, David had some comments about educators. So we'll go that order.
Okay, Ronald, thanks. My October presentation will deal very pointedly with why governments don't respond to the kind of information you and many others have been presenting. And in terms of democratic health, Ontario just had an election where 43% of the registered voters voted. So I don't see that as a healthy system. One of the attractions of GDP is that it's just so easy. It's one number. But it serves, it's only a measure of the commercial marketplace. It serves the growth, I'll call them growth profiteers rather than wealth producers. And the asking them, going to them and saying, our metric is wrong, we need to come up with a better metric, to me is like going to Al Capone and asking for permission to set up a crime commission. Why would they change that? I think they're very aware of what the impacts will be. I just think we're barking up the wrong tree. And I think their interests have to be exposed rather than, I think we're making a mistake asking them for permission. So who should we be talking to? Certainly the young people, but there doesn't appear to be anyone in government or in the media, because the media is owned by investment banks. There doesn't appear to be anyone that would be willing to listen. Who can we talk to?
Yeah, that's basically you're saying what I was saying at the end, and I agree with you. It took me 20 years to realize that we'd be talking to the wrong people. I have to, it's a mea culpa. I have to confess that we were aiming at this policy audience. We thought we could persuade them. We thought that they would listen to the numbers, to the evidence, to, who doesn't want to know the truth? And we were wrong. I'll tell you an interesting story. Just GDP, by the way, is not that easy to calculate. There's an interesting little story here. I was involved in a national roundtable on environment and economy initiative that seemed to be going the right direction 15 years ago. And we had a meeting in Ottawa, and there was a representative from the Ministry of Finance there. It was actually at that time Paul Martin's representative, and actually the assistant director of Stats Canada was there. And at one point, and it was naive, I just asked, because by the way, just to make clear, GDP is made up of separate statistics for every industry. It's a huge amount of collection has to go into aggregating everything into that one number. It's actually expensive, time consuming, and it's not such an easy number to aggregate. So I just asked him, I said, because the issue had come up of, well, it's too expensive for us to put all this effort into environmental statistics and social statistics and so on. And I said, is it really necessary to, why do we have to calculate GDP on a monthly basis and release the statistics every 3 months and so on? Couldn't we do it once a year? And I remember the Assistant Director of Statistics Canada, there was a long pause, a long, very uncomfortable pause in which he said afterwards, well, the Americans do it this way, so we have to. And we've always done it this way. That was his answer. That was the best answer. There's no good reason. If we could spend some of those resources that are currently used on collecting GDP statistics into regular reporting on unpaid work, on environmental statistics, if we could put even a fraction of the GDP resources into collecting the measures we really need, we would have an alternative ready.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't think business needs GDP. metrics. They do, but I don't think they need them in the kind of detail that,
No.
that is being spit out. So that I think you're making a great point. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, David Doherty has another question, and Ralph Martin would be on deck.
Yeah. So what I was wondering is whether the people that we should be educating are actually professors and students in economics and accounting, rather than whoever it is at whom we've been directing the messages thus far.
Yeah, well, I had to give I gave a talk at Dalhousie University a few months ago, and I told the students that they had to give their economics professors a really hard time because, I mean, the basic problem, Dave, is the way economics is currently taught, the way textbooks are currently written. Economics is being taught within a very limited and basically, I would say, false paradigm. The economy is presented to students as a closed system. It's not presented as part of a larger social and environmental sphere. The economy is not situated within society, and it's not situated within ecological reality. So the very economic paradigm on which the textbooks are written is so fundamentally flawed that I put economics professors in the same category as I would put politicians and economists out there. I think that they're not an agent of change because their very upbringing is designed to see the economy as this closed box. I don't know where to go except, I don't know, when Greta started talking, I said, oh. And by the way, I don't know if you've seen, there's a little exchange between Greta and David Attenborough. It's just 3 minutes. It's on BBC.
Yeah, I've seen it.
It's beautiful.
Mhm.
It's beautiful. David Attenborough basically says, look, I've been saying exactly what you're saying for, 2 decades, and no one paid a blind bit of attention. And now people are listening to you. So there's something about our young people coming to the fore and saying, you've stolen our future. How dare you do that? The way Greta bellows at the world's leaders. I don't see any other way right now. Well, I'm not going to, I see one other way, but maybe that's so politically incorrect that I dare not even say it. But anyway.
I have a guess. It's Extinction Rebellion.
Well, I mean, that's I put in the same category with Greta. No, I was going to say this, that we were talking about democracy earlier. If Xi Jinping, the president of China, wanted to go down in world history as the person who saved the earth, he actually has the ability to do it. He doesn't have to look over his shoulder. So I sometimes wonder whether our democratic systems are actually capable of dealing with what humanity currently faces. So I know it's politically incorrect to say that. So,
Well, I'll put a link in the chat to something I wrote and have got posted up on our website about how we might be able to improve governance by going to a different system. It's still democracy, but it's quite a different system, kind of hybrid system, much more related to what the ancient Greeks had, although everybody would get to participate if he or she had capacity. I'll put that in the chat and you can perhaps read it. It'll take you 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Ralph. Haven't seen you in years.
It's really good to see you again. I'm
Fellow Maritimer.
I'm here in Upper Canada now. This is where I was born, but I was in Nova Scotia for 21 years and always a CFA when I was there, but I always felt like a Nova Scotian and loved being there, and great to see you. I'm struck by what you said about evidence, and I would agree that evidence alone is not going to get us where we want to go, but surely evidence has to be part of the package, whether it's what Greta uses or Extinction Rebellion or other political activists or whoever uses, or even Xi, if he's going to make a big move, he's got to have the evidence to make the right moves.
Yeah, I don't mean to, I mean, as a number cruncher, I don't mean to put down evidence. What I was trying to say is that I used to believe that evidence would talk.
Yeah.
I used to believe that telling the truth would actually, who would not want to hear it was what I naively thought. So it's not, no, evidence is critically important. But I think the naivete on my part came in thinking that by itself, that alone, I've never been good at PR or marketing or any of that that stuff, and I realized that in some way that's what it's all about. Just produce. Look at the IPCC. Are those people frustrated? I'm voicing my frustration, but look at climate scientists today who've been saying the same. How is Jim Hansen feeling today? He was saying this to the American government back in the 1980s. You know, and it's not as if we didn't have everything we needed to take action 35 years ago. We did have. So it's just the assumption that it's definitely not to put, I still believe in seeking the truth. I believe it completely. I believe that evidence matters. But what I was mentioning is that at least I have to say that, you know, I so respect when Greta says, don't listen to me. She says, listen to the scientists, which means, yes, evidence matters, but somehow or other, it does not talk to the policy arena.
Right.
It doesn't talk to the world of economists. It doesn't, that alone is not going to make change happen.
Yes, I think the word I used the most in my teaching career was data. And sometimes the students would just look at me with blank looks. Like, it's very important, but it needs to be linked to a story and to something that makes sense in how they see life.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm with you. Yes, exactly.
Great.
So when a teenager says, you've stolen my future, that's based on hard evidence.
Yes. Yes.
Ouch.
And it's a story that makes the hard evidence talk.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's the end of the questions that have lined up. Unless somebody's got a really pressing issue, I'll turn it over. I think Dave is going to thank you, Ron. And I thank you too.
Be with you in just a second. Where are you? There we go. Okay, well, thanks for the fascinating talk today, Ron. This certainly goes in with many of the other presentations that have come in our now quite long ongoing Zoom presentation series. I would encourage anybody who happens to see this online to visit our website. You can register to stay informed about new things that are coming up on the website. You're welcome to join us. You're welcome to make a donation if you wish. If you subscribe to our channel, that'll also be helpful. There are now somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 videos on there covering a wide range of topics, and I hope you find them of interest. So Ron, thanks again. This has been a wonderful experience.
Thank you.